Hello and welcome back to Voice of Real Life. I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude to all my subscribers for joining this channel. If you're new here, welcome. Today let's revisit a murder that took place in 1863, one you may not be familiar with. Elizabeth Scott, the first woman to be hanged for a domestic violence-related murder. Elizabeth Scott may not be a household name, but as the first woman executed in the colony of Victoria in 1863, one would think her heartbreaking story of domestic abuse would be more widely recognized. Elizabeth was trapped in a cycle of repeated and sustained domestic violence, enduring relentless abuse at the hands of her husband, Robert. Living in a time when such cruelty was often overlooked or dismissed, Elizabeth found herself isolated and powerless. Her days were filled with fear, as Robert's temper could flare without warning, turning their home into a place of terror rather than safety. At just 12 years old, Elizabeth found herself on a journey that would significantly shape her life. She was sent to the isolated northwest region of the colony, where she took on the role of an indentured servant at Goomalaby Station, a property located near the burgeoning town of Benalla in Victoria. The landscape was rugged and remote, a stark contrast to the life she had known. Elizabeth worked diligently, her days filled with labor as she adapted to her new surroundings. Less than a year into her service, her fate took a dramatic turn when her indenture was purchased by Robert Scott. The transaction, reportedly for the price of 6 bullocks, marked the beginning of a new chapter for Elizabeth. Robert Scott, a man more than 20 years her senior, was a figure of authority and stability in her life. Their union, however unconventional by today's standards, received the blessing of Elizabeth's mother, reflecting the customs and attitudes of the time regarding marriage and familial alliances. As Elizabeth transitioned from servitude to marriage, the societal views of that era played a significant role in shaping her destiny. Marriages were often seen as strategic arrangements, serving to strengthen family ties and secure economic stability. In this context, Elizabeth's marriage to Robert Scott can be understood not just as a personal bond, but also as a practical decision influenced by the values and circumstances of the time. The implications of such an arrangement would ripple through their lives, affecting their social status and the dynamics of their family for years to come. Elizabeth was a child bride, wed at 13 to a man who was 3 times her age. Even for the colonial era, when girls typically married young, 13 was exceedingly early for a bride. Nevertheless, marriage was viewed as an important achievement. It marked a woman's entry into society and represented a significant personal and social milestone in her life. Elizabeth, a young mother of 2 small boys, was overwhelmed by the much older Robert. Together they ran a bush inn near Mansfield for 10 years. They had 5 children, of whom 3 died in infancy. Robert fell into alcoholism and became a serial abuser of his child bride. Each evening after a long day at work, Robert would visit the local tavern. What began as a casual drink with friends soon spiraled into a routine of excessive drinking. Despite her suffering, Elizabeth yearned for freedom and a chance to reclaim her life. The emotional scars of her ordeal ran deep, impacting her sense of self-worth and hope for the future. As the violence escalated, she began to explore desperate measures to escape her grim reality. Elizabeth was reportedly on good terms with 2 local men. David Gedge was employed at a staging area for a coach service between Mansfield and Jameson. The other man, Julian Cross, was an Asian worker hired by Scott to assist with various tasks in the business. Around midnight on April 11, 1863, Scott faced the consequences of his increasing violence when a single shotgun blast blew apart his skull, killing him instantly. According to some reports, while Scott was in one of his drunken stupors, either Gedge or Cross shot him and tried to make it look like a suicide. Elizabeth was not even in the room when the murder occurred, but she, together with the 2 local men, was arrested. The murder initially baffled the police due to the absence of a clear motive. Local rumors hinted at a possible affair between Elizabeth and the lodger, David Gedge. Elizabeth's reaction to this insinuation, characterizing her husband as a jealous drunk, likely did not help her case. It seemed to suggest that Robert had reasons to be jealous. This led the police to believe they had uncovered a motive for the murder. Victorian judicial records reveal Elizabeth's tragic experience of domestic abuse, but the Crown prosecution focused on the alleged affair rather than the abuse itself, shaping the narrative of the case. The prosecutor persuaded the all-male jury that her husband's murder had paved the way for Elizabeth's relationship with David Gedge. She was branded an adulteress and portrayed as a female monster who had enticed Gedge and her cook, Cross, to kill her husband with false promises. Despite the lack of evidence that she fired the fatal shot, the prosecution depicted her as the cold-hearted mastermind behind the murder, captivating the Victorian public with a tale of infidelity and violence. During the trial, Elizabeth's defense team failed to provide an alternative explanation for her supposed involvement in the crime. The only argument her barrister presented was that she didn't look like a murderer. Public records indicate that Elizabeth concealed her shame behind what seemed to be a composed exterior. When questioned by police and magistrates, she downplayed the abuse and the threats to her life. In her police statement, Elizabeth remarked, "My husband used to blow me up now and then." In colonial Victoria, the phrase "to blow one up" referred to physical abuse. Robert even threatened to take her life. To mask her humiliation, Elizabeth made a brave but dismissive comment, "But I never took any notice of it." Like many victims, she altered her accounts and made excuses for her husband's violence, saying he always did it, and he never meant it, but he was always sorry. Notably, she added, there was always a pistol lying on the shelf within his reach. She also mentioned that she'd had nowhere to turn and no one to seek help from. When Robert hurled insults, taunts, or accusations at her, the only witnesses to her plight were Gedge and Cross. The neighbors neither heard nor saw anything. It was only later that they acknowledged hearing heavy falls and dull thuds, along with Robert's later expressions of affection. They may have seen his apologies as an acceptable resolution to the abuse. The indifference they displayed was typical of the era in which they lived. Elizabeth never accused her husband of wife-beating because she had witnessed the suffering her sister endured while prosecuting her alcoholic spouse in the Melbourne courts. After serving his sentence, the husband simply returned home to his wife and children, either chastened or resentful, but ultimately unchanged in his behavior. In truth, the colonial courts were ineffective at breaking the cycle of abuse, leaving her sister with no choice but to leave for a new relationship. Elizabeth was housed in the newly constructed female ward of the 1860s, which closely mirrored the layout of the men's second cell block, still in existence today. Although women had been imprisoned at the Old Melbourne Gaol since 1842, it wasn't until the female ward's establishment 2 decades later that they were separated from male inmates. The women spent their time washing, sewing, and mending their own clothing, as well as creating shirts and waistcoats for the male prisoners. Additionally, they served as domestic helpers for the governor and his family. Victoria's highly conservative Chief Justice, Sir William Stowell, often referred to as the hanging judge, oversaw the case and sentenced all 3 to death by hanging. Premier McCulloch refused to commute the sentence. Only the Herald expressed concern, stating, "There is something unusually terrible in condemning a woman, even if her crimes have stripped her of her femininity, to a sudden and shameful death." The 3 prisoners were executed simultaneously at the Old Melbourne Gaol hang near Devil's River on the 11th of November, 1863, a grim and historic sight that had witnessed many such events. As the gallows loomed, the atmosphere was heavy with tension and despair. Elizabeth, in particular, faced an uncertain fate, not just for herself but also for her 2 orphaned children, whose whereabouts remain a mystery. Despite efforts to uncover their story, no information has surfaced about their lives following their mother's execution. This tragic silence leaves their fate shrouded in uncertainty and highlights the broader impact of Elizabeth's actions on her family.